Let me first say that it's wonderful to do work for the Lord. The disciples found out firsthand what that's like in the first part of chapter 6 as Jesus sent them out 2 by 2 to share the good news that the kingdom of God was at hand and that they should repent and they should prepare their hearts. And they saw incredible things done by their hands. People were healed, demons were cast out, and many hearts were indeed prepared for the coming of the Lord Jesus. And for us, it's the same way. It's awesome to be able to participate in the furthering of God's kingdom. Now, Mark's gospel, as we've seen, is all about action, right? That's why we're calling the series Jesus the Ultimate Action Hero, because He came, broke into planet Earth to free us prisoners and to really turn the world upside down. And throughout Mark's gospel, we see Jesus constantly involved in doing that very thing, freeing a man from a legion of demons, freeing a woman who had been prisoner for a disease for 12 years, freeing a 12-year-old girl from the bonds of death, and freeing people from the prison in their own minds of thinking one particular way. And He's telling them, this is what God really meant when He said all of these things, but it's really all about action. There are times, however, when action is dependent on who's doing it. We have this tendency, I think, to kind of take the reins. All right, God, you gave me a job to do. I'm going to go out and I'm going to do it. I'm going to work hard. In fact, I'm going to work so hard, I'm going to burn myself out. And what we see here in this portion of chapter 6 is a new understanding of really who's doing the work and the warning signs of us overworking so that we're really not as useful to the Lord as we may have thought. Now, I don't know about you in particular, and I have no one in particular in mind when I say these things, but I know that some Christians find themselves in a never-ending quest to earn the right to deserve their relationship with God. Sometimes we feel so bad about ourselves and the life that we perhaps had before we came to know Jesus Christ. We feel that God had to do so much to save us. We needed that extra special grace. That we need to spend our lives trying to work really hard to please God and to work for Him so that, well, He'll just feel better about all the work that He had to do to save us. For other people, you may experience an innate sort of drive to perform. You have a performance mentality. You're always trying to accomplish things. And God has given us this great gift of salvation, so we in turn really need to try and match His great gift by performing great things for Him. For others of you, you may just simply not have a positive enough self-image to say no when asked. If you identify with any of these three attitudes, and there are more of them, you may find yourself at times burning out for the Lord. And when we go through this portion of Mark chapter 6, I want to look at both a comfort for those of you who feel overburdened and a challenge to understand who it is you are really working for and who's really doing the work. In this part of the chapter, we see two attributes of the Lord which are really key for us to understand. And that is the compassion of Jesus and then the provision of Jesus. And both tie into this idea of what we are doing for the Lord. So let's begin in verse 30. Now, Mark took us on a little bit of a history lesson at the end of where we were last time, talking about the death of John the Baptist. But back in the portion that ends in verse 13, he talked about the disciples being sent out. And in verse 30, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to Him all they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a remote place and rest for a while." For many people were coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. We don't know how long the disciples were gone on their missionary internship, but at some prearranged time, the group met back at Capernaum for a bit of an after-action report to the Lord. Notice how Mark now calls them apostles. The word apostle means a sent one. Now that the disciples have been sent out by Jesus, they are apostles. That term became a technical term for the group of the disciples, the apostles with a capital A. But in all reality, you are all disciples, apostles, in the sense that knowing Jesus Christ, He said to us, go into all the world and preach the gospel. So you too have been sent. You are a sent one. So apparently there was much to tell. And what an exciting time it must have been for those guys to gather around Jesus and say, I can't believe it. This demon-possessed guy came up to me and I reached out my hand and I said, in the name of Jesus of Nazareth, come out of him. And the demon left. I thought the guy was going to thrash me, but he ended up leaving. And diseases were healed. Lives were changed. Hearts were touched. And there's really something incredibly exhilarating about participating in the work of the gospel, like nothing else you can do. There is something incredibly special to witness a life that has decided to follow Jesus and to be able to pray with that person. It's an unbelievably wonderful feeling. And then it's great to come back together and to share what God has done. And as we begin our own outreach efforts here at Calvary Newberg here this year, we're going to do the same thing. We'll get back together again and discuss what's taken place, what the Lord has been doing. I'm sure that they would say things to the Lord. He would give them feedback and provide them with more instructions on what He wanted them to do. But then notice what He says. Come away by yourselves to a remote place and rest. The trip itself had been exhausting. Now that the disciples were back in Capernaum, there were so many people crowding around them, they couldn't even run out to McDonald's to grab a burger. And I really like how Jesus desired this for His disciples. And I think it's a good word for anyone who labors for the gospel. Sometimes we think we just need to completely spend ourselves, because after all, Jesus gave His all for us. But there's a fine distinction, I think, between allowing Jesus to own all of you and of somehow morphing that into, I need to work really hard, I need to kill myself over ministry because Jesus was killed for my sins. And it's putting us back in the ownership place. Jesus, after this time, He said to them, come away by yourselves and rest. And there is a time for us to work, and there is a time for us to rejuvenate and to rest. The Lord knows this life is not a sprint. It's a marathon. And we need to work in such a way that 50 years from now, we'll still be serving the Lord. We won't have been so completely burned out that we don't want to have anything to do with church. And it's sad to say, though, I have met a number of people who have burned themselves out so thoroughly that they are no longer really serving the Lord at all. I still want to be serving Him if, God willing, 50 years from now, I'm still alive. I don't know if it'll be quite 50 years at this point. I'm kind of shooting for another 48, though. God, here we go. My grandfather lived till he was 101, so that's kind of my goal. I want to outlive my grandfather. Anyway, you're really not of any long-term use to the Lord if you just completely burn yourself out. And so Jesus said to the disciples, let's get away and let's have some time to rest and rejuvenate. So verse 32, they went away in the boat by themselves to a remote place. But many saw them leaving and recognized them. People ran there by land from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. So He stepped ashore. He saw a huge crowd and had compassion on them because they were sheep, like sheep without a shepherd. Then He began to teach them many things. Well, Luke tells us that the men got into a boat and were headed to Bethsaida. And there's some controversy about that because in a moment it's going to say they got in the boat again and went to Bethsaida. So we'll talk about that here in a second. There were perhaps two of them in that region. But look at what happens here. The guys get into a boat and they take off to go to a remote place. Let's get away from the crowds. But the crowd saw where they were going, and they started following them because now they recognized there were not just one person that was providing healing. Now there were 13 of them. All the more reason to be able to follow them. And so they came with them, came ahead of them, and Jesus, as he steps out of the boat, I love what happens. He stepped ashore, it says, and he had compassion on them, for they were like sheep without a shepherd. Reminds me of what Moses prayed to God to provide a leader so that literally the people would not be sheep without a shepherd. We find that in Numbers chapter 27. The Lord appointed a leader for Israel at that time whose name was Joshua, which is the Hebrew word where we get the Greek, Jesus. And we are indeed sheep, though we don't really like to admit it. Little lambs are kind of cute, but sheep are kind of dumb. They just kind of follow along wherever. They're a little bit like lemmings, I suppose. They would just, if the leader went off a cliff, they would just go off the cliff with them. Us humans are very much like that, unfortunately. We pretty much easily follow the person with the most interesting rap or the most intriguing personality or the one who promises the most return upon our investment. And yet here Jesus comes as the good shepherd to lead us to true green pasture. And in fact, we're going to see here in a second, that's exactly what he does to the people literally, I think as a picture spiritually of what Jesus provides for us. In verse 35, when it was already late, his disciples approached him and said, "This place is a wilderness, and it's already late. Send them away so they can go into the surrounding countryside and villages to buy themselves something to eat." Now, it's interesting to me that Jesus waited for the disciples to come to him. The time of day is after 3 p.m., so the sun is kind of on its downward arc. The disciples start to worry, there aren't any Burger Kings here. We're out in the wilderness. People are going to need to walk a distance to find a village to be able to buy some food and find a place for the night. So it was really out of compassion that the disciples came to Jesus, and they said, "We need to send these people away. Send them away." And I do find it interesting that Jesus was in the process of teaching these people. And he seems unconcerned about the time of day. And I think that it also points us to the fact that there's an important spiritual principle. And that is that we need to focus first upon getting that nourishment from the words of Jesus before we focus on getting those material things in order to sustain us. Jesus knows our need. We're going to talk about that here in just a little bit. But the disciples were still pretty much focused on this age thinking. Maybe their tummies were growling a bit themselves because after all, it said back in Capernaum, they hadn't even had time to eat. So here they took off to go to a remote place. They spent all this time with Jesus teaching the people. They're, tapping their sundials going, "Come on, Jesus, it's getting late. I'm getting really hungry. A really good cheeseburger and fries is sounding really good to me right now." I don't know if maybe that was part of the motivation there. But of course, when they come to Jesus, they say, "Oh, Jesus, the people, they're getting hungry." Growl, growl. So he says, "Send them away so they can buy themselves something to eat." And then Jesus responds to them in a way that must have just really set them back, right? He says in verse 37, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "Should we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?" 200 denarii, by the way, was about 8 months' wages. So this is not a small amount at all. It may have represented everything they had in their small treasury. They were thinking in terms of this age. Okay, there's a need. It takes money to buy food. Here's how much money it's going to take. All right, Lord, I'm presenting back to you this impossible situation. How are we going to run to the nearest village, spend 8 months' wages buying food and bringing it back here? Isn't this often what happens to us, though? When faced with a need that is overwhelming, our first thought is, well, how can I do this? Jesus is setting them up. They couldn't do it, and yet Jesus commanded them to. Does Jesus ever put you in a situation like that as well? Your life has become overwhelming to you. You just can't handle it anymore. And you think, how can I get out of this? How can I solve this? And yet Jesus is there, and He's saying, you can do this. The key is they had to come to the end of their resources to tap into the resources that were available to them in the Lord Jesus Christ. Had they come back to Him and said, okay, Jesus, clearly we can't do this. What do you have in mind? Would things not have been a little bit different? They wouldn't have had to have run around trying to do a quick collection, expend all of this energy if they had just said, okay, clearly, Lord, I don't understand once again. I'm being set up by you once again, but okay, what's going on? What lesson are you trying to teach me? He'd go, okay, now you're where I want you. We just kind of skip a step there, and it's awesome. Jesus often puts us in exactly that kind of position. As He said in John chapter 15, you can do nothing without me. And yet later, Paul would write, I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. So the first thing Jesus asks them to do is to check their resources. He says in verse 38, and He asked them, how many loaves do you have? Go look. When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Now, this was apparently the lunch of a small boy. We read that in John chapter 6, where this same miracle is recorded. Makes me wonder if that's all the crowd had. There were probably 10,000 people there. It would surprise me a little bit if no one had brought a scrap of food with them, and the only person who thought to provide any kind of food at all was some wonderful Jewish mother who said, son, you cannot leave without me giving you lunch. Here's 2 loaves and some fish. You take it with you. Or, this is just me, okay, I'm just positing this, looking at the text. I wonder if that little boy was the only one who was willing to give up what he had for the use of the disciples. I think there's some great lessons in that as well. As little as this little boy had, he had enough of an understanding to go, I can't give food for everybody, but I have my little lunch and I'm glad for you to take it and use it. I wonder what that little boy thought just a little bit later on. Anyway, we'll get to that. It's amazing to me, however, what one small act of generosity can accomplish in the hands of the Master. So they brought what they had to Jesus, and in verse 39, He instructed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in ranks of hundreds and fifties. Mark is the one who gives us this little detail of them sitting down in the green grass, but I love that, especially when it comes to thinking of Jesus as the Good Shepherd, Psalm 23, where He talks about leading us into good pasture. And the Lord will always do that for us. Lead us to a place of nourishment. Lead us to a place of satisfaction. But here, they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties, and we don't really know why, but it's most likely that they separated the men from the women because this was the customary Jewish fashion. So then verse 41, he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke the loaves. He kept giving them to his disciples to set before the people. He also divided the fish among them all. Everyone ate and was filled. Then they picked up 12 baskets full of pieces of bread and fish. Now those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. This miracle, by the way, is recorded in all 4 Gospels, one of the few. Here Jesus takes this little boy's lunch and he blessed, he broke, and he gave. The verbs are kind of interesting to look at here. The word broke, when it talks about him breaking the bread, is in a tense that suggests a one-time act. So Jesus broke the bread once, while the word gave suggests a continuous action. I would have loved to have been one of the disciples standing by that basket, wouldn't you? You know, he breaks the bread and then he just keeps lifting out pieces of it like that second half just never ended. But I think there's something even cooler contained in this idea. Because if Jesus was speaking about more than just giving food to the belly, but talking about being their shepherd, leading them into good pasture, providing nourishment, providing life for them, Jesus himself was broken to set us free from the prison of sin. He was broken once. But the life that he gives out to us through relationship with him never ends. That one sacrifice provides life for anyone who would come to him. And it just keeps coming and coming and coming. Just such an awesome, awesome picture. So, all the people got food, and I don't know where they came up with the baskets. Apparently people were more free to hand over their baskets than they were their lunches, but you know, okay. They kept saying, all right, they're carrying, here, fill this basket, okay, carry it around, and then the people would all grab their fish and their bread, and then finally everyone had their full. And there were 12 baskets left over of fish and bread. Obviously there's significance to that fact. And I love it. Here the disciples had come back from this trip. They were exhausted. They were hungry. Jesus said, let's go by boat. They go by boat thinking maybe he's going to take them somewhere and get them something to eat. And yet what happens is they have this big feast, and instead they're trying to scour out, instead of food for 12, they're trying to find food for 10,000. And so they go through all this and they end up being waiters. So they're walking around famished, fainting, handing out food to all of these people, looking hungrily at all this bread and all this fish. Maybe they're thinking to themselves, yeah, here we go again. Always got to be serving, never served. Oh, woe is me. And then it's over. Each one of them comes back and they set down a basket full of food. I'm sure that wasn't lost on them at all. We came here maybe just wanting one loaf and one little fish, and we end up with a basket full. And that's how it is for us in the body of Christ, not in physical, literal baskets full of food, but in baskets full of blessings, spiritual blessings, character in our lives, satisfaction, joy, peace. Serving the Lord is always with its rewards. It's just not this age kind of rewards, and we as Christians, we kind of get mixed up about that. But the rewards are great, none the same. Jesus desires for us to rejuvenate. He also cares about our physical needs. He will always do that for us. I'll talk more about that here in just a second. So, it says immediately in verse 45, he made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of them to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And when, after he'd said goodbye to them, he went away to the mountain to pray. So, there are a couple things that could be going on here. And one might be that here the disciples once again kind of caught up short, but then are allowed to participate in this incredible miracle. They're kind of going, yeah, we knew all along that's what was going to happen. Maybe sort of begin to take credit a little bit. I don't know. I'm just kind of reading that into the text. So Jesus, in another one of Mark's action words, says immediately. He said, all right, guys, you've had your fill. The miracle's done. Now get in the boat and go away. There's another reason for that, however. Because in John's gospel, we read that the people saw this miracle and were trying to make Jesus their king immediately. That would have been really bad. Jesus is the king. But Jesus will not take his earthly throne until after the crucifixion and the resurrection, until earth is prepared for the return of this king. It's not going to be a group of ragtag Israelis who march into Jerusalem and say, this guy fed us food, so now let's make him king so we'll always have something to eat. I'm afraid it's going to be a whole lot more impressive than that. When Jesus comes back to sit on his throne, there will be absolutely no question about who is the ruler of the universe. This isn't the time. So instead of allowing them to create their own rebellion and bring Jesus along in it, voluntarily or involuntarily, he says, okay, meeting's over, you are dismissed, go home now. And to the disciples he says, okay guys, time to go back into the boat and take off once again. And I like what Jesus does. When he's finished dismissing the crowds, saying goodbye, goodbye now, goodbye, goodbye, he goes to the mountain to pray. He goes to be by himself. Jesus did this often, and especially after or prior to very difficult times in his life. He goes up to the mountain to spend time with the Father. Various reasons that he could have done that. One, we have to remember this is a human Jesus. 10,000 people are saying, we want you to be our king right now. He knows he is the king. For us, sometimes being liked becomes more important than being obedient, to sticking to the main thing. Now, I'm not saying that Jesus was in any way not going to be obedient to the Father, but he was human. He knew he had to get away, refocus on his mission, which was the cross before the throne. But if Jesus had to do it, don't you think maybe it's a good idea for us to do that as well? And especially after we see success in our efforts to work for the Lord. We don't want it to go to our heads. We don't want to let popularity lead us. We want the Spirit of God to lead us. And so we get away and we go, all right, Lord, this really good thing happened. Now, would you set my mind straight? Would you show me what you're really about? So that's what Jesus does. And then in verse 47, when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. He saw them being battered as they rowed, because the wind was against them. Interesting. So these guys set out on the Sea of Galilee, and they have a headwind. They can't raise the sail. They've got to raise their arms and work at it. And the wind was so strong that they've been rowing. Now it's, as we're going to see here, it's about 3 o'clock in the morning. And they have been rowing and rowing and rowing for hours because after all, Jesus told them, go to the other side. So they're doing it, and they're not getting anywhere. They're only like 3 miles out from land. But look at how this is worded here. Jesus went up to pray. He's focusing on the Father. Father, what do you want me to do? What's our mission? After his time of prayer, then he turns and focuses back out on the sea to his men that he's been given charge over as their shepherd. And all I can imagine is 3 miles. It's not that far away, but it's at night. So what Jesus is probably seeing 3 miles away is that little lantern that they would hang on the sides, kind of from a pole from these first century fishing boats. And so he's seeing this lantern out there, and he's just watching it, and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And it says he saw them being battered as they rowed because the wind was against them. I love that. Do you sometimes feel like you're rowing against the wind? You're working yourself to death and not going anywhere? And you're thinking to yourself, where is Jesus? How come he isn't helping me? How come he hasn't made this miracle come about so that I'll just get to where I need to be without any effort? And what we don't realize is that Jesus is always up on the hill watching us with compassion. The Scriptures tell us that we have a high priest who is very, very aware of our weakness and very compassionate when we are battered. And so around 3 a.m, he came toward them walking on the sea and wanted to pass by them. Now, that's almost makes it sound like Jesus comes strolling by. Hey guys, what's up? See ya. But the sense of it probably is that Jesus meant to pass by them, but with all intentions of actually coming to them. When they saw him, verse 49, walking on the sea, Mark says again, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they saw him and were terrified. The glow of those little lanterns probably only extended maybe 10 feet on all sides of the boat, maybe just a little bit more, but you know how that works. The light begins to fade off into the darkness. And I don't know about you, but when was the last time you were out on the boat at night and saw somebody walk out on the water to you? Can I have a show of hands? Nobody? Yeah. Nobody walks on the water. And so here they see what looks to be a ghost kind of floating over the water. And of course they're afraid. I'd cry out. I'd be terrified. I don't know about you. It says immediately, again, Jesus didn't let the battering of the storm alone, but came to his disciples, and he didn't let the fear of the disciples stand. Immediately he spoke and said, "Have courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." I love those words. In the Greek, when he said, "It is I," it's the words, ego ami, I am. Remind you of anything? The name of God. When Moses said, "Who will I tell you has sent me?" when God sent him back to the Israelites in Egypt to rescue them, and he said, "Tell them, I am has sent you." We translate the word Yahweh. Sometimes it's pronounced Jehovah. The reason we don't know how it's pronounced is because the Jews felt the name was so holy that they took out the vowels. So we have YHWH, you fill in the blank. They wouldn't speak the name, it was so holy to them. But it literally means in the Hebrew, the becoming one. I will become whatever you need. And it says, don't be afraid. I'll be whatever you need. I am is here. And when Jesus is with you, as he promised, I will never leave you or forsake you. There is no need for fear. And you can have boldness in whatever Jesus has called you to do. That's what the word courage there means, boldness. Sometimes the circumstances in our lives frighten us to death. But Jesus says to us, have courage. I am is here. You have no need to fear. Sometimes the Lord moves or urges us to move deeper in our relationship with Him, to trust Him with things we never would have trusted in Him before. In an impossible circumstance, we think God can't be asking me to do this, could He? And just remember those words and have that courage and that boldness, because with Jesus there is no reason for fear. Now notice, the sight of Jesus frightened them. The words of Jesus brought great comfort. In John's Gospel, there's another little part of this story. Before Jesus climbs into the boat, someone says something to him. Someone who told the stories by which this gospel were based, Peter, who says, Lord, if it's you, bid me come out on the water with you. Jesus, I don't know, maybe a little bit of a wink, twinkle in his eye, says, okay, Pete, come on out, the water's fine. So Peter steps out of the boat, and you know the story. As long as he's looking at Jesus, he's fine. He's actually walking on the water. But then he sees the wind and the waves. He sees the storm that was battering them, and he begins to sink. And he cries out to the Lord, and the Lord reaches out. I guess, I always kind of picture Peter's head has gone under the waves. And there's just this arm stretching out like this, and then Jesus, whoop, grabs him like that and lifts him up. And it's a wonderful picture, which if I get into, we'll never get out of here. Here's my question for you. Why didn't Peter include this in telling the stories to Mark? When we read the story, we think, wow, Peter walked on the water. But I wonder if when Peter remembered it, all he can think of is sinking down under the waves. Was he embarrassed? I don't know. It doesn't say, because the story's not there. But I did notice this. John, when he wrote his gospel, he puts the story in. And if you guys don't know it, there's this kind of rivalry going on between John and Peter. In John's gospel, when Resurrection Sunday comes around, John is very clear to account for us the fact that in the foot race to the tomb, who won? It was John. Just the little subtle interesting things there in the Gospels. However, so why walk on the water? I mean, really. To me, it's the most unusual miracle that Jesus performed while he was here on earth. But it was absolutely, undeniably a miracle. There was no great fish swimming under Jesus to hold him up like some Greek god or something. He literally had the assistance of the molecules of H2O that formed some sort of a solid wherever his feet stepped. And of course, my mind always goes to, did he walk over the waves like icing on a cake? Or did he let the waves lap through his legs and had just sort of, barely walking under the water? I don't know. Just questions that go through my mind. But after he said, don't be afraid, in verse 51, he says he got into the boat with them and the wind ceased. They were completely astounded. Why? Because they had not understood about the loaves. Instead, their hearts were hardened. What we need to understand is that Jesus is building a group of disciples to understand something, to live out something. And what is that? I would submit to you that it is a recognition of who Jesus really is and submission to His authority and provision in their lives. They just didn't get it yet. Who is this guy? So He comes walking out on the water just to tweak their minds. He is not only the Messiah, He's the Son of God. And Jesus will continue to do that until at the end He will do the ultimate miracle, which is to resurrect from the dead. So this chapter, as I mentioned before, is really about two things: the compassion of Jesus and the provision of Jesus. We see His compassion on the disciples after their missionary journey. He wants to get them away so they can rest and rejuvenate. He has compassion on the people when they arrive at the shore. Jesus isn't first thinking about filling their bellies with food. He's thinking about filling their hearts with His Word, and so He teaches them many things. But then when they are hungry, He has compassion on them to provide that food that they need in order to maintain their physical bodies. And then we see Jesus with compassion on the disciples as they're being battered by the storm, rowing for their lives out in the sea. And so He comes actually walking on top of the water in order to give them courage. And in John's Gospel it says as soon as He got in the boat, they arrived at the shore. And it almost sounds like He got in the boat and then suddenly they felt the ground underneath them. I don't know if that's actually the case of what happened, but hey, it happened later on with Philip, got into a transporter and was beamed from one place to another. So we see the compassion of Jesus, and then we see the provision right along with that. For the weariness, Jesus provided a place for them to go to rest and rejuvenate. Even as for us, when we are working for the Lord, instead of burning out for Him, take time to go away. Take time to go before the Father and pray. And we see Jesus providing for the people who were in need of a leader. Somebody who could bring them finally to good pastures, just as Jesus provides that leadership in our lives. But He also provides for our needs. In Matthew chapter 6, He says, don't worry about your life, what you'll eat, what you'll drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Look at the birds of the sky. They don't sow or reap or gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. He says your Father knows your needs and will provide them. It may not be in the way that you think or in the timing, as we talked about before. Time for Jesus was irrelevant, but timing, very important. It just happens to not be our timing. But Jesus provides what we need when we need it. We just need to rely on Him more and more. We need to understand who He is and what He really is doing in our lives and transforming us into His character to be used as a bright light into this dark world, and then just depend on Him to provide whatever else it is that we need to accomplish that mission. And then finally, He provides in the times when we are completely beyond ourselves. The disciples were out there on the boat, exhausted, tired, alone, in the midst of a storm. Do you ever find yourself in a place like that in your life? But Jesus showed up in a miraculous way. And He said to them, have courage. It's me. Don't be afraid. Jesus says that into our lives too when we are in the midst of our most difficult and frightening situations. Did Jesus tell them, you can stop rowing now, I'm going to take you to the other side, here's the plan, it's all going to work out great? Did He tell them that? Didn't tell them a thing. All He said is, I'm here, fear is gone, trust me. And then He got in the boat. That's really what Jesus does in our lives as well. When we are at our worst fear, Jesus doesn't promise us that everything will just instantly work out the way that we wanted it to all along. He does promise His presence. And He promises in that is comfort. In John chapter 16, He said, I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace. You'll have suffering in this world. Be courageous. I've conquered the world. Jesus has already conquered the situation that you face that brings you the most fear. You may still need to go through it, and suffering may occur. But he says, be courageous, be bold, because nothing can happen to you outside of God's will. And as long as God's presence is with you, then what the hymn writer says really is true. It is well with my soul. Let's pray. Father, at times you challenge us in ways that are beyond our ability to comprehend. And it's really all about us understanding who you really are and the fact that you provide in ways we could never imagine. And so I pray, Lord, that for our lives this week, you would show us your presence in our problems and your provision in our trials, Lord. Maybe it's not a way we ever would have thought to have solved it or to have walked through it. And yet you tell us, Lord, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me and you uphold me with your right hand. So, Lord, do that for us. Uphold us. Walk with us. Be in our boat as we are battered by the waves, Lord, and speak into our lives that you are here and that we can be bold and do not need to fear, because you will provide everything that we need to accomplish the things you have set before us. We thank you for this, and we pray these things for your glory in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.